The humidity of Lagos didn't hit David like a wall. It felt like a heavy, familiar blanket, smelling of salt spray, diesel fumes, and the sweet, rotting scent of overripe plantains. After 12 years in the sterile, bone-chilling winters of Toronto, this heat was supposed to be the breath of life. He stood outside Murtala Muhammad International Airport, his hand gripping the handle of a single suitcase. In his pocket was a set of keys to a mansion he had never stepped foot in. A 5-bedroom sanctuary in Lekki Phase 1 that he had spent over $400,000 building from across the ocean. He hadn't told his wife, Sarah, or his younger brother, James, that he was landing today. He wanted the cinematic moment. The door swinging open, the gasp of pure joy, the realization that their long-distance struggle was finally over. But as he looked at the taxi driver's rearview mirror, David saw a man he barely recognized, gaunt, grey-haired at 38, with eyes that had seen too many double shifts at the hospital. As the car pulled into the gated street he'd memorized from blurry WhatsApp photos, a cold shiver bypassed the tropical heat. The house was there, towering and magnificent, but the gate was wide open. A sleek black SUV he didn't recognize sat in the driveway, its engine still ticking as if it had just arrived. And from the balcony of the master suite he'd designed for his wife, he heard a sound that didn't fit the homecoming script. The low, rhythmic rumble of a man's laughter, and it wasn't his brother's. If you had sacrificed a decade of your life in a foreign land to build a dream for the people you love, only to arrive unannounced and find a stranger's car in your driveway, would you walk through that front door or turn around and leave? Tell me how you'd handle that first moment of doubt in the comments below. To understand why David was standing on that driveway with a heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, you have to understand the man he used to be. 12 years ago, David was a brilliant but broke medical graduate in Ibadan. He had married Sarah, his university sweetheart, in a ceremony so small they had to borrow the chairs from a local church. Sarah was his North Star, the woman who stayed when he had nothing but a stethoscope and a dream of a better life. "Go, David," she had whispered at the airport back in 2014, her eyes wet with tears. "Go to Canada. Build the foundation. I'll look after things here. We'll be the success story everyone talks about." And he did. For 12 years, David didn't live, he functioned. He worked as a personal support worker while studying for his Canadian medical exams, often pulling 80-hour weeks. He lived in a basement apartment in Scarborough where the walls grew mold and the heater only worked on Tuesdays. He ate canned beans and discounted bread, funneling every single cent, thousands of dollars every month, back to Nigeria. He sent money for Sarah's luxury hair business, which she claimed was flourishing. He sent money for his younger brother James's master's degree, and then for James's consultancy firm. But most importantly, he sent the money for the project. The project was the house. Every month, James would send him videos of the progress. "Bro, the foundation is set. Send another $20,000 for the pillars." "David," Sarah picked out the Italian marble for the kitchen. "It's expensive, but you want the best for her, right?" David would look at the photos of the rising walls on his phone screen during his 15-minute lunch breaks in the hospital cafeteria. Those photos were his fuel. He missed funerals, he missed births, he missed his own youth. He communicated with Sarah via late-night FaceTime, calls where the connection was often grainy. She always looked beautiful, draped in expensive lace he'd paid for, telling him how much she missed him, how the house was almost ready for its king. He had become a ghost in his own life, a human ATM, all for the promise of this return. He had envisioned Sarah running into his arms, the scent of her perfume erasing the smell of hospital antiseptic from his lungs. He imagined James shaking his hand, showing him the deeds, the receipts, the proof of their shared empire. David had sacrificed his 20s and half of his 30s for a phantom reality. He had traded the physical presence of his wife for the digital updates of a house. He believed that love could be sustained through wire transfers, and that loyalty was a natural byproduct of provision. He was a master of medicine, but a novice in the dark psychology of greed and distance. He didn't realize that while he was freezing in Canada, the warmth he was providing back home was fueling a fire that might just burn him alive. The car in the driveway was a Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon. David knew Sarah's car, a modest Lexus he'd bought her 3 years ago. This was something else. This was the car of a man who owned the road. As he stood there, the silence of the neighborhood felt predatory. The palm trees didn't sway, they watched. He felt the weight of the keys in his pocket. Keys James had sent him via courier last month. They felt heavy, like lead. He realized then that he wasn't just coming home. He was trespassing on a life he had funded, but never lived. David took a deep breath, forcing the lump in his throat to subside. It's probably just a visitor, he told himself, his mind desperately grasping for a rational explanation. Maybe James started a high-end car rental business. Maybe Sarah has a client over for her hair brand. He wanted to believe in the sanctity of the 12 years he'd given away. He wanted to believe that the sweat he'd poured into double shifts at the Toronto General Hospital had bought him a sanctuary of peace. He adjusted his jacket and walked toward the massive mahogany front door. He imagined the interior, the Italian marble Sarah had described over WhatsApp, the smell of home-cooked agouti soup waiting for him, and the sound of his wife's laughter filling the halls. He could almost feel the softness of the Egyptian cotton sheets he'd shipped from Canada 3 months ago. This was the moment of his coronation. He was no longer a struggling immigrant. He was the owner of this estate, a man who had won the game of sacrifice. As he reached for the handle, he felt a surge of pride. He had done it. He had pulled his family out of the trenches of Abaddon and planted them in the fertile soil of Lekki. He took the key out of his pocket, but before he could insert it, he realized the door was slightly ajar. A warm, expensive scent of sandalwood and expensive cognac wafted through the gap. He pushed it open slowly, his heart fluttering with a mix of giddy excitement and a mounting, primal dread that he couldn't quite suppress. The foyer was even more magnificent than the photos, but it felt occupied in a way he hadn't prepared for. On the marble console table, where he expected to see a framed photo of their wedding day, sat a large, gilded portrait. It was Sarah, looking radiant in a shimmering gold gown, but she wasn't alone. Standing behind her, hands possessively on her shoulders, was a man David didn't recognize, tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that suggested he owned everything he touched. David's brow furrowed. A business partner? He wondered, but the intimacy of the pose felt like a physical blow to his chest. He moved deeper into the house, his footsteps muffled by a plush Persian rug he didn't remember authorizing the purchase of. The house was silent, save for the low hum of the central air conditioning and the faint clinking of glass from the dining area. He walked toward the kitchen, expecting to see the state-of-the-art appliances he'd sent money for. Instead, he saw a half-empty bottle of 1942 tequila on the island and 2 used glasses. One glass had a faint smudge of Sarah's signature deep red lipstick. Beside the glasses lay a set of car keys, the fob for the G-Wagon outside. Then he noticed the walls. He had sent Sarah dozens of framed photos of their life together. Their graduation, their first snow in Toronto before she moved back, his oath-taking ceremony. None of them were hanging. In their place were abstract African paintings and large-scale photos of Sarah traveling. Paris, Dubai, Santorini. David stared at a photo of her in Santorini, dated last July. Last July, David had told Sarah he couldn't afford to fly home because the roofing costs of the house had spiked. She had cried on the phone, telling him how lonely she was in their small temporary apartment, praying for the day the house would be done. Yet here she was, glowing under a Grecian sun, wearing a diamond necklace that David knew he hadn't bought. The air in the house suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out by the very walls he had paid to build. David's hand trembled as he reached for the Santorini photo. The date on the digital print was unmistakable, July 14th. That was the day he had spent 16 hours in the ICU, holding the hand of a dying patient, because the overtime pay was the only way to cover the emergency plumbing James had called about. He felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea. The house wasn't a sanctuary. It was a museum of his own exploitation. A soft, melodic hum drifted from the upstairs landing. David froze. It was Sarah. She was humming a song they used to dance to in their cramped Abaddon apartment. A song about eternal devotion. He moved toward the staircase, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Every step felt like walking through deep water. As he reached the top of the stairs, he saw her. She was wearing a silk robe he had sent from a high-end boutique in Yorkville. Her hair perfectly styled, her skin glowing with the radiance of a woman who had never known a day of hard labor. She was leaning against the doorframe of the master bedroom, talking to someone inside. "He's such a fool, Tunji," she laughed, the sound sharp and crystalline, like breaking glass. "He sent another 50,000 last week for the landscaping. He actually thinks we're planting a botanical garden out there. The man is so blinded by his sacrifice that he can't see what's right in front of his face." A man's voice, deep and resonant, answered from the shadows of the room. "Let him keep working, Sarah. Canada is cold, but his money is warm. Besides, once the final deed is signed in your name next month, he can come back to Nigeria and stay in a hotel for all I care. This is our kingdom now." David felt the world tilt. The Tunji in the room wasn't just a visitor. He was the man in the portrait. He was the man in the G-Wagon. And Sarah, his Sarah, was the architect of the heist. The betrayal didn't just hurt, it dismantled him. David stepped into the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light from the hallway. Sarah's laughter died in her throat. She didn't scream. She didn't gasp. She simply stared at him, her face transitioning from casual mockery to a cold, calculating mask in a matter of seconds. Behind her, Tunji sat on the edge of the bed, David's bed, wearing a pair of silk pajamas that still had the price tags from a Toronto department store. "David," Sarah said, her voice devoid of the warmth she used to fake on FaceTime. "You weren't supposed to be here until December." "The landscaping," David whispered, his voice cracking. "The plumbing. The roof. I lived in a basement for this. I skipped my father's funeral because you said we couldn't afford the flight if we wanted to finish the guest wing." He looked around the room. On the vanity sat a collection of watches. Rolexes, Omegas, each one costing more than David earned in 3 months. They weren't his. He walked toward the closet and yanked the door open. It wasn't filled with his suits or the clothes he had shipped ahead. It was a sea of designer labels for a man twice his size. Tunji's clothes. He saw a safe in the corner, its door slightly ajar, bursting with bundles of Nigerian naira and stacks of US dollars. His money. The money he had earned by cleaning bedpans and stitching wounds while his back ached and his eyes burned from lack of sleep. "Who is he, Sarah?" David asked, turning to face her. Tunji stood up then, moving with the slow, predatory grace of a man who knew he held all the cards. "I'm the man who's been here while you were building a future for 1,000 miles away, Doctor," Tunji said, emphasizing the title with a sneer. "I'm the one who managed the contractors. I'm the one who took Sarah to the hospital when she was sick. I'm the one who actually lives in this house. You're just the investor. And I must say, your ROI is looking quite poor today." David felt a cold, phantom numbness creeping up his limbs. He looked at Tunji, this stranger standing in his silk pajamas, and then back at Sarah. She hadn't moved. She didn't look guilty. She looked inconvenienced. "Is this true, Sarah?" David's voice was a low, dangerous vibration. 12 years. I haven't bought a new pair of shoes in 3 years, so you could have Italian marble. I worked through a pandemic in a foreign country while you were... What? Vacationing in Santorini with him. Sarah crossed her arms, the silk of her robe shimmering under the recessed lighting David had paid a premium to install. "Don't play the martyr, David," she snapped, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You chose to leave. You chose the hospital shifts over me. You think money is a substitute for presence? You sent checks. Tunji gave me a life. You built a house. Tunji made it a home. With my money." David roared, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. "Every brick, every tile, every light fixture in this room was paid for with my blood. I survived on bread and water in a basement, so you could live like a queen. And you brought another man into the bed I paid for." Tunji stepped forward, his chest out. "Watch your tone in this house, Doctor. You're a guest here. Sarah is the one whose name is on the preliminary documents. She's the one the neighbors know. You're just a ghost from Canada who sends wire transfers." David turned his gaze to the bedside table. There was a glass of water there. He picked it up, his hand shaking so violently the water sloshed over the rim. He didn't throw it. He just stared at his reflection in the glass. He looked old. He looked used. "Where is James?" he asked quietly. "My brother. He was the one supervising the site. He was the one who told me the costs were rising. He swore to me." Sarah let out a short, mocking laugh. "James is downstairs in the boys' quarters, David. Or maybe he's out driving the car Tunji bought him. You really thought your little brother was going to stay loyal to a man he hasn't seen in a decade? We're a family here, David. A real one. And you? You're just the benefactor. The silence that followed was heavier than the Lagos heat. David felt a sickening realization settle in his gut. This wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment or a secret affair. This was a long con, a systematic harvest of his life's work. How long? David asked, his voice barely a whisper. Since year 3, Sarah said, picking up a nail file from the vanity as if they were discussing the weather. After the 3rd year of you promising to come home next summer, and then cancelling because you wanted to save more, I stopped waiting. Tunji was the contractor's consultant. He saw the vision you had. He just decided to step into the role you were too busy to fill. 9 years, David breathed. For 9 years, you've been living with him? While I was sending you anniversary gifts. While I was crying on the phone because I missed your voice. It was easy, David, Tunji chimed in, leaning back against the headboard. You were so desperate to be the big man returning from abroad that you believed every lie we fed you. Whenever we needed a vacation, the transformer blew, and we needed $5,000 for a new one. When Sarah wanted a new wardrobe, the land prices went up. You didn't even check the receipts. You just wanted the status of owning a mansion in Lekki. Well, here it is. Look at it. It's beautiful, isn't it? Sarah stepped closer, her eyes cold. You wanted to be a hero, David. You wanted the story of the man who sacrificed everything for his family. Well, you got your wish. You sacrificed everything. You just didn't realize that while you were building this house, we were building a life that didn't include you. The deed for this land? James and I handled that. It's in my maiden name. Your name isn't on a single legal scrap of paper in this country. David felt the room spinning. The betrayal by his wife was a wound, but the betrayal by James, the brother he had raised after their parents died, was a killing blow. He looked at the safe again. He looked at the man in his bed. He realized that for 12 years, he hadn't been working for a future. He had been funding his own replacement. David felt a strange, icy calm wash over him. The shaking in his hands stopped. In the medical world, when a patient's heart stops, you don't scream. You calculate. He looked at Sarah, then at Tunji, seeing them no longer as a wife and a brother, but as a malignancy that needed to be excised. He realized they were banking on him being the broken victim, the man who would crawl back to Canada and weep over his lost investment. He slowly set the glass of water back on the nightstand, his movements deliberate and precise. You're right, Sarah, he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming eerily steady. I was a fool. I focused on the medicine and the money, and I forgot about the psychology. I forgot that when you give people everything they want without being there to watch them, they start to resent the hand that feeds them. He looked at Tunji, who was still smirking. David didn't flinch. You think you're the king of this castle because your name is on a preliminary document? You think a man who spent 12 years navigating the legal complexities of a foreign country would send $400,000 to a third-world jurisdiction without a safety net? He saw the smirk on Tunji's face falter, just for a millisecond. David stepped closer, invading Tunji's personal space. I didn't just build a house, Tunji. I built an audit trail. Sarah let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. Audit trail? David, this is Nigeria. Money talks, and the documents say this is mine. James made sure of it. You're just bluffing because you're hurt. Am I? David pulled a slim, leather-bound folder from his carry-on bag, which he had kept gripped in his left hand. He tossed it onto the bed. Open it, Sarah. Look at the bank statements. Every single transfer I made wasn't sent to your personal account. It was sent to a building trust account registered under a Nigerian corporation I formed 5 years ago, Omanigo Holdings. Sarah's face went pale as she flipped through the pages. What is this? I thought the money was coming from your personal savings. It was, David said, his voice cold and clinical. But it was routed through a corporate entity, and that entity owns the lien on this property. You see, James was managing the site, but the funds were released only upon digital verification of receipts. Receipts that I had a private investigator in Lagos verify every 6 months. I knew about the inflated costs. I knew about the blown transformers that never existed. I let you steal, Sarah. I let you think you were winning, so that when I finally arrived, the crime wouldn't just be infidelity. It would be large-scale corporate fraud and money laundering. Tunji stood up, his face reddening. You're lying. I saw the deeds. You saw the deeds James showed you, David countered. But James has a gambling problem, doesn't he? I've been paying off his debts in secret for 2 years. In exchange, James gave me something far more valuable than loyalty. He gave me the original title documents and power of attorney. He's been playing both sides, Sarah. He took your love and my money, but when the heat got too high, he chose the person who could keep him out of jail. This house isn't yours. It belongs to a company that I am the sole director of. And as of 10 minutes ago, I've triggered a digital eviction notice through the local security firm. As if on cue, the heavy iron gates of the estate began to grind shut, and the high-pitched chirp of the security alarm system began to pulse through the house. The safe life they had built on David's back was beginning to collapse. Sarah's fingers trembled so violently that the folder slipped from her hands, the bank statements scattering across the marble floor like autumn leaves. The high-pitched chirp of the security system was no longer a background noise. It was a countdown. Tunji scrambled toward the nightstand, reaching for his phone, but his bravado had evaporated, replaced by the frantic energy of a trapped animal. You think a few papers change who lives here? Tunji spat, though his voice wavered. I have boys in this neighborhood. I have connections at the station. David didn't blink. Your boys are paid in naira that comes from my Canadian dollars, Tunji. And your connections at the station have already received a digital brief of the embezzlement file I opened 3 months ago. David stepped over the scattered papers, his shadow looming large against the designer wallpaper. I didn't come here to argue with you. I came to reclaim my property. James didn't just give me the deeds. He gave me a recorded confession of how the two of you funneled over $150,000 into offshore accounts. In the eyes of the law, you aren't a couple, you're a syndicate. Sarah sank onto the edge of the bed, her face a mask of ashen shock. The man she had mocked as a fool was standing before her as a ghost of the person she once knew, hardened, calculated, and entirely cold. David, please, she whispered, the predatory edge in her voice replaced by a desperate, hollow softness. We can talk about this. I was lonely. I made mistakes, but this house, it's our future. No, Sarah, David said, checking his watch. It's my asset, and you have exactly 5 minutes to take what you brought into this marriage, which, if I remember correctly, was a single suitcase of old clothes, and vacate the premises. The security team I hired isn't the local neighborhood watch. They're a private firm that specializes in high-stakes evictions. They're at the gate now. The sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel outside signaled the arrival of the enforcement team. But as the front door downstairs groaned open, it wasn't just the rhythmic stomp of security boots that echoed up the grand staircase. There was another sound, the sharp, frantic clicking of heels, and a voice that made both Sarah and Tunji freeze in a way David hadn't expected. Tunji, are you in there? A woman's voice shrilled from the foyer. A woman in her mid-40s, dressed in a sharp power suit and carrying a briefcase that looked like it cost more than David's car, appeared in the doorway of the master suite. She stopped dead, her eyes darting from David to Sarah, and finally settling on Tunji, who looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. Mrs. Adeyemi? Sarah gasped, her voice barely audible. Who are you? David asked, turning to the newcomer. The woman ignored David, her gaze fixed on Tunji with a terrifying intensity. Tunji, I've been calling you for 3 hours. The board meeting for the development project started at 2. And then I get a notification that our joint investment account, the one we used to buy this land, has been flagged for a legal lien. She turned to David, her eyes narrowing. And who is this man in my husband's pajamas? David felt a grim, dark irony settle over him. He looked at Tunji, then at the woman. Husband. The woman, Mrs. Adeyemi, was a prominent real estate mogul in Lagos. As the truth began to unravel in the doorway, David realized the deception went deeper than he could have imagined. Tunji hadn't just been stealing from David. He had been using David's money to play the role of a wealthy bachelor to trick a powerful woman into a high-stakes business marriage. Tunji was a parasite feeding on 2 hosts at once. Sarah wasn't the co-owner of a kingdom. She was just the other woman, in a house that was being leveraged by a professional con artist against a second victim. The air in the room became electrified with a new, sharper kind of tension. David watched as Sarah's face crumbled. She hadn't just betrayed him. She had been played by the very man she chose over him. Mrs. Adeyemi stepped into the room, her presence dwarfing Sarah's silk-clad desperation. "Tunji, explain this," Mrs. Adeyemi demanded, her voice like cracking ice. "Who is this woman? And why is she in the house you told me was our private getaway?" Tunji opened his mouth, but for the first time, his silver tongue failed him. He looked at Sarah, then at David, and finally at his wife. It's a misunderstanding, Funk. She's the caretaker." "I was just... The caretaker?" Sarah screamed, the word tearing out of her throat like a jagged shard of glass. She lunged toward Tunji, her manicured nails aiming for his face. "I gave you 9 years. I gave you David's money. I gave you everything. You told me she was just a business associate." The room dissolved into a chaotic symphony of accusations. David stood in the center of it, a silent island in a sea of crashing egos. He didn't feel joy. He didn't feel the rush of victory he had imagined. He felt a profound, hollow exhaustion. He looked at the woman he had loved for over a decade, now reduced to a screaming shadow of herself, fighting over a man who had never existed. Enough! David's voice didn't need to be loud to command the room. He turned to Mrs. Adeyemi. "Ma'am, I'm Dr. David. I am the legal owner of this property, through Omanigo Holdings. Your husband hasn't been investing your money here. He's been using my funds to maintain a lifestyle that convinced you he was a peer. This house is being cleared. Now." He turned to Sarah, who was sobbing on the floor. "Sarah, there is no us to talk about. There is no mistake to fix. You didn't just break a vow. You tried to erase my existence while I was working to give you the world. You have 10 minutes. After that, the security team will escort you and your partner to the gate. Any personal items left behind will be donated or destroyed. I'm done being the ghost that pays for your life." 2 hours later, the house was silent. The G-Wagon was gone, towed away under a police report filed by Mrs. Adeyemi. Sarah had left in a local yellow taxi, clutching a single suitcase and a plastic bag of shoes, her screams of protest eventually dying down into a haunting, rhythmic wailing as the car pulled away. David sat on the edge of the fountain in the courtyard, watching the sun begin to set over the Lagos skyline. The sky was a bruised purple and orange, beautiful and indifferent. James had emerged from the boys' quarters an hour ago, his head hung low, refusing to meet David's eyes. David hadn't yelled at him. He had simply handed him a plane ticket to their home village and a small envelope of cash. "Don't ever call me again, James," David had said quietly. "Consider this the final payment for a brother I lost years ago." The house felt massive and cold. It was a masterpiece of architecture, a testament to 12 years of grueling labor, but it wasn't a home. It was a monument to a dream that had turned into a nightmare. David walked through the empty rooms, his footsteps echoing against the marble. He touched the walls, the light switches, the countertops. He had bought the best of everything, but he had forgotten to buy the one thing that mattered, a life for himself. Over the next few months, David didn't move in. He put the house on the market. He used the time to reconnect with the Nigeria he had forgotten. The dusty streets of Ibadan, the smell of roasted corn on the roadside, the unfiltered honesty of people who had nothing but still laughed. He volunteered at a local clinic, using his Canadian medical expertise to treat people who could never afford the Italian marble he had once obsessed over. He started to sleep again. The night terrors of hospital shifts and bank transfers faded. He realized that the $400,000 wasn't lost. It was the tuition fee for a very expensive lesson in human nature. He was 38, healthy, and finally free. He wasn't a man from abroad anymore. He was just David. The greatest tragedy of David's 12 years wasn't the loss of the money. It was the slow, quiet erosion of his own reality. We often talk about sacrifice as a noble pursuit, a currency we pay into the future to buy happiness for those we love. But there is a thin, dangerous line between providing for someone and becoming a ghost in your own life. When you stay away too long, you don't just miss milestones. You stop being a person and start being a bank account. The lesson here is a bitter pill for every dreamer working in a distant land. Love cannot be sustained by wire transfers alone. Trust is not a static state. It is a garden that requires the physical presence of the gardener. When you build a kingdom for someone else to rule while you are in exile, Do not be surprised if they find a new consort to share the throne. Greed thrives in the gaps left by absence. David learned that his brother's loyalty and his wife's devotion weren't failed virtues. They were casualties of a distance he thought he was conquering. True power isn't owning a 5-bedroom mansion in Lekki. It's being present enough to know whose hand is turning the doorknob. Never trade your now so completely for a later that you wake up to find the later has been stolen by someone who was willing to live in the present. The sold sign stood sharp against the manicured lawn of the Lekki estate. David didn't look back as the new owners, a young, hopeful couple clutching their toddler, walked through the mahogany doors he had once dreamt of opening. He climbed into a modest silver sedan, his only luggage a small backpack of clothes and his stethoscope. He drove toward the Lagos Lagoon as the sun began its final descent, painting the water in strokes of liquid gold and deep copper. For the first time in over a decade, the weight in his chest was gone. He pulled over by the third mainland bridge, stepped out, and let the humid, salt-tinged air fill his lungs. He wasn't a doctor from Canada, and he wasn't a victim of Nigeria. He was a man standing on the soil of his birth, watching the world move on. He took his phone out, looked at the banking app that had once been his only tether to life, and deleted it. He closed his eyes, listening to the chaotic, beautiful roar of the city. He had lost his dream life, but as he felt the warmth of the Nigerian sun on his face, David realized he had finally, truly, found his reality. This story is storytelling by Divine Tales. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment for more powerful stories.